Hey readers, welcome back to Reading Realm. Today's review is a book that I have been trying to finish for literally over a year. It's one of the ones that I carried over from last year, and Cosmos is running around. It is one that I had a hard time reading very much of at a time, for reasons that I'll get into. So Cosmos is now messing with stuff. But this is Sincerely Your Autistic Child, which doesn't really have one specific author, but more like a collection of various autistic people's accounts of aspects of their lives. And so the reason this one has been so hard for me to finish is kind of the same as I've talked about with some of my other reviews of various autistic books, is that sometimes the stuff in this can be really emotionally difficult for me to read about, in the sense of some of it can be so validating, but at the same time be a thing where it's like, that should never have happened to me or this person or anyone in the first place. So it's kind of like, it's validating, but also hard to come to terms with the fact that so many people have to deal with certain realities of various ways they're treated or things that are thought about them or anything along those lines, just because they happen to be autistic. I will say I think this one is really, really cool because having so many different voices, you have autistic people who are also people of color, you have autistic people who are also non-binary, you have autistic people who are also non-heterosexual, you have autistic people who are trans. There's a specific person in here who talks about how the identity of being autistic and trans combined made him, I believe now her, I think they were born male and now goes by she, her pronouns or some non-masculine pronouns, but that made it harder growing up to feel like they fit in than they would have if they were only trans or only autistic. A lot of people in this mention also how there's a correlation between people who are autistic may have a higher likelihood of being non-straight or non-cisgender, which is definitely the case for me. I am non-binary and also non-straight, so I think one of the people put it interestingly of like, if you already challenge social norms and don't really follow them, why would you fall into a specific gender role and or expectation of who you're supposed to be attracted to? And I definitely feel like I have related to that at times, where it's like, why should I do that just because of what I was born as and stuff? So I don't know. I think it's a really interesting point to bring up that. The other thing about this book that I think is definitely good is they talk about how the puzzle piece in relation to autism can be really damaging. Several different people talked about that because it kind of implies that autistic people are missing a piece, and how like Autism Speaks and other organizations who are supposed to claim that they help autistic people are there to try and fix or cure it, and how you should not support organizations like that. But there are other ones that some of them are listed. One of them is actually one of the editors of this who sort of helped compile all of the things, actually founded one of these organizations. But I think that's really important because I think it's easy for people who want to do good but don't do thorough research to see a charity or something and try to donate to it, even when it might actually be enforcing harmful stereotypes or something, like Autism Speaks does. So it's really nice that this provided alternatives that are supported by the autistic community and proven to not do harmful practices or anything that to try and change the person, but more to just make sure that people have the resources that they need. I think another thing is having it be in so many different voices of so many different people. There are certain, this is one of the books that I did highlight and annotate for my parents. And there's definitely parts where I went like multiple pages without having anything to highlight. I am not a parent other than to my pets and my plants. Like, I don't have kids. So the stuff talking about like being an autistic parent to autistic kids, I don't relate to. I'm not fully trans, so I didn't relate to stuff quite as much when one of the people was talking specifically about being like 100% trans and not able to accept that, and also not able to accept autism because growing up they never had examples of people like that around. And then another message that's really prevalent throughout this is the importance of showing kids basically that autistic people can still have lives and succeed, even if it isn't necessarily like a traditional successful life of like college, job, career, kids, family, whatever. They can still have a fulfilling life. And the other thing I will say is this book was originally, it said in the foreword, supposed to be sincerely your autistic daughter. So there's a lot of times in this book when it will refer to your kid specifically as she, or your girl, or your daughter specifically in the people's accounts or whatever their advice, their sections. And apparently this book was originally supposed to be about people who were female who were autistic, because female autism is studied far less and misdiagnosed far more often than male autism, because the entire diagnosis formula is all based on how it presents in male people and also in younger kids typically. So adult females often have a harder time getting a diagnosis. But as they were starting to work on the book, they realized there were a lot of people who were maybe not identifying as a daughter or a girl or a woman who still had valuable insight, so they changed it to the gender neutral child. But that is why in the book itself there's a lot of mentions of the she pronoun or your girl. There's one person who specifically took a lot of her time to talk about it, to discuss the ways that female autistic people can be more at risk of like intimate harassment compared to people who are not autistic, and compared to male people. Not to say that can't happen to male people as well, but in this context she was saying these are important things to teach your female child about like bodily autonomy, and that it's okay to have personal space and stuff like that. So I think that was valuable. A lot of this, I think, doesn't relate to me, but I wish my parents had read this when I was younger, because it talks about like younger kids that I don't relate to that anymore, but I probably was going through stuff like that back then, or like high school age. I think if they'd read this back then, they would have taken some of the stuff I said more seriously than they did, because They just didn't understand what I was dealing with, and that it was actually caused by something and not just me trying to skip school or something like that, which is another thing that they mention in here about like being able to have the vocabulary to describe things and to be able to communicate needs or limits or what you want or don't want and all of that. So I think that all of that is really important as well. And just in general, I think this is a really valuable resource. I think it was hard to read because, again, it's like it left me with a lot of bittersweet sort of feelings about like no one should have to go through this, and I hate that it happened to me, and that like I was very isolated when a lot of it was happening just because like I didn't know how to explain what was happening, and my parents didn't know enough about autism to know what to be looking for from what I was experiencing and stuff like that. But it is a very, very good book. And I would definitely recommend it to anyone who has an autistic child of any age in their life. A lot of these people writing are older and have families or lives that they've established for themselves. And so for some parents who may think that the diagnosis is kind of a prison for their child, it could help them to see like examples of other people who are, if not thriving in a traditional sense, at least living the best life that they can within their ability and or disability. And I also think it's just a good resource for people who are autistic and who maybe feel like there was stuff that happened to them that they would take comfort or validation from seeing that other people have also experienced very similar things, because there definitely were a lot for me. And I think it's also really good to read a book like this that has a huge variety of different people's experiences, because one of the people put it really well that being a person of color can drastically affect how your disability is viewed, and or being autistic can drastically affect how people think they can treat you, especially if you are of color. And so that's something that I personally don't relate to as much, because for the most part I am Caucasian and grew up in a Caucasian family. And although where I grew up has a lot of racial and ethnic diversity, I am not a minority in that sense where I live. And so hearing that about these people, and also how there was no representation for people like them in any kind of media, I think this is valuable for people who may be in less represented demographics, who wants to hear about people from a similar ethnic or racial or cultural background. There's stuff in here from someone who is African American, there's someone who is Puerto Rican, there's someone who is Chinese and also adopted. And I believe that person was also trans or something non-cisgender. So I think that all of these are really, really good. There's one part where it says like common issues and needs. And so it talks about the issues and like what can help those, which I think is a good way to talk about it, instead of just being like, they need stuff. This tells actual like things that could help with those issues without trying to fix them, but trying to just accommodate and support them. Um, and I think that all of that is very, very valuable and very good. Um, and also, it won an award by an autistic community. So I think that it is well vetted among autistic people to be a good resource. I would say it is as an autistic person. The one thing I do feel like I just noticed this, and I have nothing against the person who wrote this part. I think all the rest of what they said was really insightful and valuable and validating and important. But there was one person who said something about, like, show your child examples of people who have been successful who are autistic women. And one of them that they mentioned was Temple Grandin, which I do have a book that she wrote here, and I know she's like one of the sort of first people to write an autistic autobiography and is like a big name in autistic like history. I don't know if history is the right word, but like among autistic people, she is like an example of someone who is very successful and autistic and female. But the thing that kind of bothered me about that part is every person she gave an example of was doctor someone. And I don't think this was the intent, but to me it kind of was like, so the only successful autistic people we should be showing examples of have to be people who have doctorates. Which, in my opinion, as someone who never planned to go to grad school and never wants to go to grad school, and I don't think I could deal with grad school, I want examples of autistic people who succeed with maybe a bachelor's degree or an associate's degree, or maybe did something completely unrelated to academic measures of success, but was still able to thrive and contribute to the world in some way, or have a successful, fulfilling life for what they want in their life, and not just people with an educational title. And I don't think that the person who was writing that meant it to come across like that. It was just something that I picked up on. And I think it could also just be like the people who are famous as examples of successful autistic people might just be people who are famous for something that also gave them a PhD or something like that. But I feel like there are examples of other people who are autistic in like entertainment or in sort of like advocacy fields that are not necessarily academic that should also be acknowledged. So that is like the one nitpick that I feel like there are definitely parts I don't relate to. That was the one thing where I kind of was like, I disagree about this specific list. I think those are all good resources, and I might go look up some of them. But I don't want to only look at people who have PhDs. But with that being said, overall, I highly recommend this book to anyone who wants to have a better insight into all the ways autistic people can live and or feel and or have different levels of ability, because there are people in here who are fully nonverbal and sometimes can't even like move very well. There are people in here who are like very articulate and can have conversation and have a job and a career and a marriage and kids. And there are some people who only found out they were autistic because their kids were diagnosed, and then they were like, wait, I do all these same things. There are some people who are diagnosed as like a 2-year-old. So it really has a huge spectrum, just like autism is a spectrum in what is explained and given examples of and advice for here. So it's very, very, very good. I highly recommend it to anyone, especially if you have an autistic person in your life or are an autistic person, because even if you are not fully nonverbal, or if you are not a young child, or if you are not uh, in a career, or if you are not also a different minority of gender, sexuality, or race, or also if you are in a minority of those things, there's something in here that can resonate with everyone. And I think the range they picked is very, very good. So, with that being said, let me know what you're reading right now. And I would love to hear what you think about this book if you've read it or if you're planning to read it. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe. I have a goal of a certain number of subscribers I want to hit by the end of the year. So if you subscribe, that would really help me out. And keep reading. Bye!